The motorcycle screams through the parking lot at 40 miles per hour, weaving between parked cars with mechanical precision. 2 men aboard, driver and shooter, both wearing full-face helmets that obscure their identities. The shooter carries a MAC-10 submachine gun, 32 rounds in the magazine, another 64 rounds in spare mag strapped to his chest. Their target is German Jimenez Paneso, a mid-level cocaine distributor who made the fatal mistake of shorting Griselda Blanco on a payment. Paneso is walking from his car toward the mall entrance, accompanied by his bodyguard, completely unaware that the motorcycle approaching from his left carries his execution. The shooter opens fire from 15 feet away. The MAC-10 fires at 1,145 rounds per minute, which means the first burst, 10 shots in half a second, catches Paneso across the chest and abdomen before he can even register danger. The bodyguard reaches for his weapon but never clears the holster. 8 more shots, and he's down, bleeding out on the asphalt while shoppers scream and scatter. The motorcycle doesn't stop, doesn't slow. The driver accelerates through the parking lot, onto Kendall Drive, disappearing into Miami traffic while witnesses are still processing what they've seen. 47 seconds from first shot to complete escape. 2 men dead. 0 arrests. 0 evidence beyond shell casings and traumatized witnesses who couldn't describe the killers beyond 2 men on a motorcycle. This was the Dadeland Massacre, the hit that introduced the motorcycle assassination method to American organized crime. Before July 11, 1979, contract killings in Miami typically involved car bombings, drive-by shootings from vehicles, or close-range handgun executions. After July 11, 1979, the motorcycle hit became the preferred method for drug-related assassinations across South Florida, spreading eventually to Latin America, Europe, and anywhere traffickers needed to eliminate targets quickly in crowded areas. The method's inventor was Griselda Blanco, a 46-year-old cocaine trafficker from Medellin who'd built a distribution network worth an estimated $2 billion annually. Between 1975 and 1985, Blanco's organization was responsible for approximately 200 murders in Miami, most of them executed using the motorcycle method she'd pioneered. The technique was so effective, so terrifying, that it fundamentally changed how drug violence operated in America. But here's what made Griselda Blanco different from every other drug trafficker operating in Miami during the cocaine boom of the late 1970s and early 1980s. She wasn't just running a business, she was enjoying the violence. Where other traffickers viewed murder as a necessary evil, an operational cost of doing business, Blanco treated assassination like an art form. She refined techniques, trained killers, developed methods that maximized terror while minimizing risk of capture. The motorcycle hit was her masterpiece. Mobile, fast, almost impossible to defend against, and psychologically devastating because victims never saw it coming until the moment bullets started flying. The method would kill 200 people in Miami over 6 years, transform the city into America's murder capital, and prove that innovation in crime, like innovation in any field, comes from someone willing to think beyond conventional approaches and accept whatever casualties result from their experimentation. 15 years earlier, 1964, Medellin, Colombia. Griselda Blanco wasn't born into drug trafficking. She was born into poverty that made drug trafficking seem like the only escape route. Born in 1943 in Cartagena, Colombia, she grew up in one of Medellin's worst slums, where violence was ambient, police were corrupt or absent, and survival meant developing skills that legitimate society didn't value. By age 11, she'd participated in her first kidnapping. By 14, she'd killed someone. Accounts vary on whether it was self-defense or murder for hire, but the result was the same. Blanco learned early that violence could solve problems, generate income, and establish reputation. By 20, she was working for small-time traffickers, smuggling emeralds and cocaine between Colombia and New York. But Blanco was ambitious in ways that terrified even her criminal associates. She didn't want to be a mule or a mid-level distributor. She wanted to control the entire supply chain from production to street sales. In the early 1970s, most Colombian cocaine reached the United States through Cuban and Mexican intermediaries, who took substantial percentages for their role in transportation. Blanco saw an opportunity: eliminate the intermediaries, establish direct connections between Colombian producers and American distributors, and keep 100% of the profits. She moved to New York in 1971, settled in Queens, and began building a distribution network that would eventually span the entire East Coast. Her method was to use Colombian immigrants, people from Medellin's slums, who were desperate for money and willing to take risks that American criminals wouldn't consider. She'd recruit them, train them, set them up with apartments and cover identities, and use them to transport cocaine that she'd personally arranged to have smuggled from Colombia. The violence started almost immediately. Blanco's philosophy was that loyalty came from fear, that the only way to prevent theft or cooperation with authorities was to make the consequences of betrayal so terrible that nobody would risk it. Associates who stole from her were tortured before being killed. Family members of informants were murdered. Competitors who encroached on her territory simply disappeared. By 1975, Blanco's organization was generating millions of dollars monthly, but she'd also attracted attention from law enforcement, who were beginning to connect the spike in cocaine-related murders in Queens to a Colombian woman whom informants described as more ruthless than any male trafficker they'd encountered. When authorities began closing in, Blanco made a decision that would transform Miami's cocaine trade. She moved her entire operation to South Florida. The Miami expansion, 1976 to 1979. Miami in 1976 was perfect for Griselda Blanco's ambitions. The city had a massive Cuban population that provided cover for Spanish-speaking criminals. It had a culture of corruption, where police and customs officials could be bought for reasonable prices. It was geographically close to Colombia, making smuggling routes shorter and more efficient. And most importantly, it was wide open. The cocaine trade existed, but was disorganized, controlled by small-time operators who had no idea what was about to hit them. Blanco established herself in Miami through systematic elimination of competition. Existing traffickers received an offer: work for her organization, accepting subordinate roles, or die. Most chose cooperation. Those who refused were killed using methods that sent clear messages. Bodies found with their tongues cut out. That's what happened to informants. Bodies found dismembered. That's what happened to thieves. Bodies found with family members murdered alongside them. That's what happened to anyone who thought they could challenge her authority. But the violence was creating problems. Drive-by shootings and car bombs attracted law enforcement attention. Witnesses existed. Physical evidence could be collected. Several of Blanco's associates had been arrested when shootings went wrong, and they couldn't escape quickly enough. She needed a method that was faster, harder to defend against, and offered better escape opportunities. The solution came from observing motorcycle couriers in Medellin. Blanco noticed that motorcycles could navigate through traffic that would trap cars, could access areas closed to vehicles, and could disappear into narrow streets and alleyways. She also understood that two men on a motorcycle, one driving, one shooting, created a mobile weapons platform that was vastly more effective than a single shooter in a car. She tested the method first on low-level targets, refining the technique through trial and error. Early attempts failed when shooters couldn't maintain accuracy while the motorcycle was moving, or when drivers couldn't navigate while gunfire erupted behind them. But Blanco invested in training, brought in experts from Colombia who'd used similar methods, and eventually perfected a system that worked with devastating efficiency. By July 1979, she was ready to use the method for a high-profile hit: the elimination of German Jimenez Paneso, a distributor who'd been shorting payments and needed to be made an example. The Dadeland Mall execution was meant to demonstrate the new method's effectiveness, to show every trafficker in Miami that Blanco could reach anyone, anywhere, and that resistance was futile. July 11, 1979, the Dadeland Massacre. The operation was planned with military precision. Blanco's intelligence network had identified Panesso's schedule, knew he'd be at Dadeland Mall that afternoon, knew he'd park in a specific area and enter through a specific entrance. 2 of her most experienced sicarios were selected. One an expert motorcycle driver, the other a marksman who'd killed over 20 people in Colombia before moving to Miami. They arrived at the mall at 2:30 p.m., 17 minutes before Panesso's expected arrival. They circled the parking lot, identifying escape routes, timing traffic patterns, ensuring they understood exactly how to execute the hit and disappear. At 2:46 p.m., Panesso's car entered the lot. The motorcycle moved into position. The actual hit took 12 seconds. The MAC-10's rate of fire allowed the shooter to put 18 rounds into Panesso and his bodyguard before the targets even understood they were under attack. The motorcycle's acceleration got them out of the immediate area in under 10 seconds. By the time police arrived, 4 minutes after the first 911 call, the killers were 3 miles away, the motorcycle abandoned in a pre-positioned location, and a getaway car carrying them to a safe house where they'd wait until the investigation cooled. But the hit had unintended consequences. The Dadeland Massacre, as media immediately labeled it, occurred in a crowded shopping center in broad daylight. Witnesses included families with children, elderly shoppers, employees leaving work. The level of violence, automatic weapons fire in a public space, shocked Miami residents, who'd become somewhat accustomed to drug-related murders in rougher neighborhoods. The media coverage was extensive and negative. Local news led with the story for days. National coverage portrayed Miami as a war zone controlled by Colombian drug traffickers. Tourism suffered. Business leaders pressured politicians to respond. The Miami Police Department and DEA suddenly faced enormous pressure to solve the case and prevent similar incidents. But they couldn't solve it. The killers had left no evidence beyond shell casings. Witnesses couldn't identify anyone. The helmets and the speed had made that impossible. The motorcycle was stolen, wiped clean, abandoned. Every investigative lead evaporated within days. Griselda Blanco's method had worked perfectly from an operational standpoint, even if the political blowback was more severe than anticipated. The epidemic, 1979 to 1985. The Dadeland Massacre established the motorcycle hit as the preferred assassination method for Miami's cocaine traffickers. Within months, copycat killings occurred across South Florida. By 1980, motorcycle hits were happening weekly. By 1981, the method had spread to other cities, New York, Los Angeles, Houston, wherever Colombian trafficking organizations operated. Griselda Blanco's organization was responsible for approximately 40% of Miami's cocaine-related murders between 1979 and 1985, with an estimated 80 deaths directly attributable to motorcycle hits she'd ordered. The other 120 deaths came from imitators, rival traffickers who'd adopted her method, and general escalation of violence as the cocaine trade grew exponentially. The psychology of the motorcycle hit was its most devastating aspect. Traditional assassination methods offered some defensive options. You could avoid certain neighborhoods, hire bodyguards, vary your routes, stay in secure locations. But motorcycle hits could happen anywhere: parking lots, restaurants, gas stations, even residential neighborhoods. The attackers appeared suddenly, killed within seconds, and disappeared before anyone could respond. The only defense was constant vigilance, and even that often wasn't enough. Miami's murder rate exploded. The city went from 349 murders in 1979 to 621 murders in 1981. The medical examiner's office ran out of storage space for bodies. Morgue workers testified to Congress that they were stacking corpses in hallways because refrigeration capacity was exceeded. Over 70% of murders were drug-related, and investigators estimated that half of those involved the motorcycle hit method that Griselda Blanco had pioneered. Law enforcement struggled to respond effectively. Traditional investigative methods didn't work when witnesses were too terrified to talk, when physical evidence was minimal, when killers could strike and disappear in under a minute. The DEA, FBI, and local police formed task forces specifically targeting motorcycle assassinations, but the prosecution rate remained under 10%. For every killer arrested, 3 more were operating. Blanco herself seemed untouchable. She moved between safe houses, used multiple identities, maintained layers of insulation between herself and street-level operations. Her organization was cellular. Individual teams operated independently, knew nothing about other teams, couldn't implicate her even if arrested. The few associates who did cooperate with authorities tended to die before trial, usually via motorcycle hit, which discouraged further cooperation. The personal toll, 1982 to 1984. Griselda Blanco's success came with personal costs that would eventually contribute to her downfall. Her paranoia increased as her wealth grew. She believed everyone was stealing from her, informing on her, plotting against her. Associates who'd been loyal for years were killed based on suspicions rather than evidence. Her own sons became involved in the organization, which made them targets for rivals and for law enforcement. In 1982, her youngest son, Michael Corleone Blanco, named after the Godfather character, survived an assassination attempt when attackers opened fire on his car. The would-be killers used the motorcycle method, which added bitter irony, Blanco's own innovation being turned against her family. She responded with characteristic brutality, killing not just the attackers but their families, sending a message that targeting her children meant extinction. But the violence was attracting exactly the attention Blanco couldn't afford. The DEA had made her a priority target, dedicating dozens of agents to building a case. They couldn't penetrate her organization directly, so they focused on the perimeter, arresting low-level associates, offering deals, slowly working up the chain. By 1984, they had enough evidence to secure indictments on drug trafficking and conspiracy charges. Blanco's response was to escalate the violence. She ordered hits on witnesses scheduled to testify. She attempted to bribe or intimidate prosecutors and judges. When those efforts failed, she planned an attack on a courthouse, intending to kill everyone involved in her case and escape during the chaos. The plan was discovered before execution, which added attempted murder of federal officials to her charges. On February 17, 1985, DEA agents arrested Griselda Blanco at her home in Irvine, California, where she'd been living under an assumed identity. She'd been trying to reduce her profile, to let the organization run without her direct involvement while heat died down. But the investigation had progressed too far. The evidence was overwhelming. She was extradited to Florida to face charges that would keep her in federal custody for nearly 2 decades. The trial and imprisonment, 1985 to 2004. Griselda Blanco's trial in 1985 exposed the full scope of her operation to public scrutiny. Prosecutors presented evidence of cocaine distribution worth billions of dollars, murder conspiracies involving dozens of victims, money laundering through legitimate businesses, and systematic corruption of law enforcement and public officials. The most damning testimony came from former associates who'd agreed to cooperate. They described Blanco's personal involvement in ordering murders, her enjoyment of violence, her requirement that certain victims be tortured before death. One witness described a murder where Blanco had personally shot a former associate who'd stolen $250,000, then ordered the body dismembered as a warning to others. The jury convicted her on drug trafficking and conspiracy charges. Murder charges were harder to prove. Most witnesses were dead or too terrified to testify. But the drug convictions carried sentences that effectively meant life in prison. She was sentenced to 15 years federal time, followed by additional state charges that would extend her imprisonment. In 1994, while serving her federal sentence, Blanco was indicted for 3 murders that prosecutors in Miami had finally built solid cases on. The trials revealed details about the motorcycle hit method, including training procedures, payment structures, and selection criteria for sicarios. The testimony confirmed what investigators had suspected. Blanco hadn't just ordered the hits, she'd developed the entire methodology, trained the killers, and refined the technique through trial and error. She served 19 years total, becoming a grandmother in prison, watching her criminal empire collapse as associates were arrested or killed, observing the evolution of drug trafficking into something more sophisticated and less personally violent than her methods had been. The Return and Death, 2004 to 2012. Griselda Blanco was released from prison in 2004 and immediately deported to Colombia. She was 61 years old, having spent nearly 2 decades in federal custody. The Colombia she returned to was vastly different from the one she'd left in the 1970s. The Medellin cartel had been destroyed. Pablo Escobar was long dead. A new generation of traffickers had adopted lower profiles and more business-like approaches. Blanco settled in Medellin, living on money she'd hidden decades earlier. Authorities estimated she'd stashed tens of millions in offshore accounts and property that was never seized. She maintained a low profile, avoided involvement in current trafficking operations, and seemed content to live out her remaining years in relative anonymity. But on September 3, 2012, her past caught up with her in the most fitting way imaginable. Griselda Blanco was killed in a motorcycle hit outside a butcher shop in Medellin. 2 men on a motorcycle pulled alongside her as she left the shop. The passenger opened fire with a handgun, and she died on the sidewalk at age 69. The method she'd pioneered, refined through 200 murders in Miami, had come full circle. The sicarios who killed her were probably too young to know she'd invented the technique. They were just using the most effective assassination method available in Colombian criminal culture, unaware they were killing the woman who'd created it. Police never arrested anyone for Blanco's murder. The investigation was cursory, the evidence minimal, the witnesses unwilling to talk. Just another motorcycle hit in a city where such killings remained common 40 years after Blanco had introduced the method to Miami. The legacy, Griselda Blanco's motorcycle hit method, didn't die with her. It spread globally, became standard practice for organized crime groups from Latin America to Europe to Asia. The technique's effectiveness, mobility, speed, difficulty defending against, made it attractive to any criminal organization needing to eliminate targets in urban environments. By 2010, motorcycle hits were occurring weekly in Mexico City, Bogota, Rio de Janeiro, Naples, and dozens of other cities. The method had evolved: better weapons, more sophisticated training, improved coordination between driver and shooter. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged from Blanco's original innovation in 1979. The 200 deaths attributable to Blanco's organization between 1975 and 1985 represented a fraction of the total impact. Thousands more died globally using methods she'd pioneered. The psychological terror she'd created in Miami, the understanding that death could come suddenly from a motorcycle, anywhere, anytime, became permanent feature of drug war violence worldwide. Miami eventually recovered from the cocaine wars of the 1980s. Murder rates declined as law enforcement adapted, as traffickers moved operations to other cities, as the cocaine trade became more sophisticated and less publicly violent. But the city's reputation had been permanently altered. The Miami of 1990s television shows and tourism campaigns couldn't erase the memory of the early 1980s, when cocaine money and motorcycle hits had transformed a tropical paradise into America's murder capital. The Dadeland Mall still operates today, though under different ownership and with security procedures that didn't exist in 1979. The parking lot where German Jimenez Paneso died has been repaved countless times. Nothing marks the spot where the first high-profile motorcycle hit occurred, where Griselda Blanco's innovation was successfully demonstrated, where a method that would kill thousands was proven effective. July 11th, 1979, taught the criminal underworld a lesson that resonated across decades: that innovation in violence, like innovation in any field, comes from someone willing to think beyond conventional approaches and accept whatever casualties result from their experimentation. Griselda Blanco wasn't the first woman to run a major drug trafficking organization, but she was the first to pioneer a killing method that would be copied globally. 200 murders. One method, a legacy written in blood across parking lots, sidewalks, and streets worldwide. The motorcycle hit remains Griselda Blanco's most enduring contribution to organized crime, proof that the most dangerous innovations aren't always technological or financial. Sometimes they're simply new ways to kill people efficiently. And once perfected, such innovations spread like viruses through criminal networks that value effectiveness over ethics. The woman who invented the motorcycle hit died by motorcycle hit, killed by a method she'd created, in a city where her innovation had become so common that nobody even remarked on the irony. That's the legacy. Not the billions in cocaine profits, not the empire that collapsed, but the killing method that outlived her, that continues spreading, that will likely still be used decades from now by people who've never heard her name, but are employing techniques she refined through 200 murders in Miami between 1979 and 1985.